Okay, students, I'm going to try this again because I just failed in recording my first audio lecture after 40 minutes, which is a little longer than I wanted to go anyway. I couldn't hear my voice. So let's try this again, and maybe I can try to cut down some of the time as well this time. All right. So um, I'm trying to be in touch with you guys as far as this crazy time we're going through with coronavirus and being home on quarantine and things like that. I know it's real wild. I'm going to be posting a just more kind of general discussion onto Google Classroom because I'm really curious to hear from you guys and kind of how your lives are going at home, what kind of things are different or the same, how you're dealing with it, and maybe we can get a little support from each other and just check in with you there without kind of eating up time on the lecture here to talk about it. But just know that I'm concerned for you guys. I'm worried about you guys. I'm missing school already and wish we could be doing this in the classroom. But I hope you guys are staying safe and enjoying your time under quarantine. What a crazy historical development for your generation and all our generations. I've never been under quarantine, you know. So, all right. Anyway, Unit 6, okay, is where we are going to be ending um, our course as far as studying for the test goes, okay? And then depending on the developments CCSD puts out, if we return to school, I would love to keep talking to you guys about things that come after Unit 6, but we will see. I'm not sure it's going to end up like that. So, Unit 6 is called by the College Board Consequences of Industrialization. And Unit 5 was all about sort of the revolutions of the Atlantic world and the Enlightenment, but also things like the Industrial Revolution, right? This revolution in technology. Unit 6 explores the consequences of that. But as we can see from 6.1, the topic I posted to Classroom, what that really translates to is using that industrial power to continue the growth of those maritime empires. Europeans started to expand in Unit 4, only now that conquest is accelerating and the areas that are able to be conquered are increased as a consequence of this new manufacturing and industrial power, especially the military power that it gives to these countries that we'll explore in later lectures as we wrap up this unit here. A lot of historians refer to this period as the age of imperialism. Imperialism really is a word that refers to empire building, right? Imperial conquest, taking over parts of the world, subjecting those people as conquered people and um, leveraging their labor and resources to benefit the mother country, right? I mean, it's setting up colonies and stuff around the world like we've been talking about. So that's one thing I want you guys to pick up on there is that this is a continuation sort of Unit 4 and not necessarily something totally new. It's just the means through which it's being done and the ability for Europeans to make it effective have been augmented by technology to make it a lot more effective. The other thing is that it's not just Europe involved in this, right? That the United States starts to become a kind of global power in some sense in its own right by this time, and engages in all kinds of imperialism on its own. And then towards the end of this unit, we'll look at Japan, who has a really incredible story of progress from a pre-industrial to an industrial country in a matter of decades, right? Probably quicker than just about any other country pursues it and is able to kind of save themselves from imperial conquest or European or American domination by catching up. It's kind of a neat story we'll look at as part of this unit as well. The aggression we're talking about, this exploitation of foreign lands, the conquest of these areas and holding them as colonies is something that continues until the 1960s or later, much later, sometimes into the 90s for some African countries or into the late 90s for places like Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a great example where you can see like the ongoing tension and conflict that this period of imperialism creates for the world, right? That this thing that happens in the 1800s, due to imperial, pursuits by the British Empire, is causing problems in modern day China, right? And then a whole host of other topics, right? Ethnic and religious conflicts in the world, the spread of disease like the global spread of coronavirus right now, um, the world's distribution of languages, right? Why is English spoken so much, in so much of the world, or Spanish or French? Imperialism, right? Why is Christianity the religion that covers the globe? Imperialism. Why do you find European descendants, scattered about all parts of the globe, in South Africa or in Australia or in New Zealand or in North and South America or wherever, right? Imperialism. Terrorism. Um, it's, you never want to be on the side of advocating or explaining kind of the mentality of a terrorist, but I mean a lot of the anger and resentment in parts of the world that becomes, the focus of terror groups, you can trace back to this period of time as well. The global wealth inequalities that exist between the poor parts of the world and the wealthiest parts of the world, part of that wealth inequality can be, again, kind of traced back to this period of time. All right. Although it's not only explained by that, right? But some of those inequalities can go back to this. So this is part of the reason this is one of my kind of favorite topics to look at, and one of the things that I think is most important in world history. And to start us discussing this, and what I really want to just explore with you guys is 6.1 in this lecture, the reasons for it. To start talking about that, I want to look at two maps with you, kind of have you examine a couple maps here before we dive into it. Notice a couple things that are going on in this map. One, if you look at Europe, there are some countries there that we recognize, right? England, France, Spain, Portugal. We looked a lot at in Unit 4 and have been talking about since. But there's some countries from Unit 5 that we don't see on this map of the world in around the time of 1700, right? There's no Germany and there's no Italy. And then there's these other kind of empires in Europe that, we've talked about a little bit: the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Poland, Lithuania. We haven't gotten into very much. It's not around very long. But that's Europe. Okay, so a little bit different than we see it today, or than we even talked about it in period 5, right? If you look at North America and South America, right, they are still covered in the colonies of Britain and France and Spain and Portugal, with a little bit of scattering of some Dutch colonies here or there. North America, the western part anyway, is still held, big chunks of it anyway, by Native American societies and tribes. And there's going to be a series of Indian wars, we call them in American history, to conquer those people and either displace them onto Indian reservations or bring them into the United States. But North and South America still mostly under the control of European countries, right? Look at Africa. You will see a lot of these empires and kingdoms and things like that on this map of Africa are native African kingdoms, right? African places ruled by Africans. But even at this time in 1700, there are a couple European colonies there. Okay, places like the Angola or Congo colonies by the Portuguese, also on the east coast, where Mozambique is today, is a Portuguese colony at that time. And in South Africa, there's the Cape Colony, founded by the Dutch a little bit before this in the 1650s. Those had been established there for a while, right? These trading post kind of kingdoms and empires. But a lot of what's going on in Africa is still African, and that you're going to see a big change in the next map. Look at the size of the Ottoman Empire, how it extends into North Africa, the Middle East, into Europe. And then you'll notice the Mughal Empire and the Qing dynasty and empire in China, or in Asia, excuse me. But There is a little Portuguese colony in India at that time, but otherwise it's mostly under the control of the Mughals. The Qing dynasty is still mostly in control of big chunks of what is today China, right? Minus Tibet and um, where groups like the Uyghurs and things like that live in Western China. And then what else would I draw your attention to? The last thing I guess would be like Japan. You see, is still ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa family, remember, had cut off kind of all contact with the outside world except through the port of Nagasaki. Um, and they're still under the rule of that family and still closed off in 1700. And then you'll see the area of Oceania, so sort of Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, a lot of Pacific islands are um, barely discovered by this time. Honestly, Australia only recently discovered and not yet really colonized by any means. Right, still in the under the control of the kind of native peoples that live there. And that's all going to change. If you fast forward 2 centuries to 1914, this is technically right outside of the period of time we want to look at, but right as World War I starts and right as Period 6 ends. And this is a map of the world, and there's some important changes on there. Europe now has Italy and Germany, but it's still got countries like Austria, Hungary that aren't around anymore, but looks a lot more like modern day Europe. Um, North America is now entirely under the control of Canada and the United States. All the Native American tribes have been conquered, displaced, or exterminated through wars and disease. Um, and the small percent that remains are displaced onto Indian reservations, as they're called. We'll see kind of similar things take place in a couple other countries during that same time, but that for sure, even though it's not taking place across oceans, is imperialism, right? That's the growth of an empire, conquering these various ethnic groups and societies and multiple languages of people and adding them to your domain, right? That's an empire. Look at Latin America, is all independent states now, except for a little patchwork of a couple other countries here that are still European colonies. But since the American revolutions, our American Revolution and all the Latin American revolutions, these are all independent countries. But the big idea there is that the Western Hemisphere is more or less no longer under the control of Europeans. All those colonies have moved east. Look at Africa, is almost entirely under the control of Europeans. The British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Portuguese, they've all got holdings there. The only places that are not going to come under the control of Europeans during this period is Ethiopia, which actually resists conquest with their military, defeats the Italians that try to invade. And this country on the west coast here, if you can see, is Liberia. That is not a colony exactly, but a kind of colony founded by the United States for newly freed slaves, ex-slaves, escaped slaves to to go and live in Africa, basically. Liberia, sort of named after liberty. All right. Um, but because of that country's relationship with America or the United States, it also never quite gets conquered. But in a sense, it's kind of conquered, even though we weren't really exploiting it that much like some of these other countries will. You will see that the Mughal Empire is gone, and so are a lot of these Southeast Asian kingdoms. The Mughal Empire is now one gigantic British holding that includes what is modern day Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, parts of Myanmar and Singapore, what is today Vietnam and parts of Cambodia or Laos and stuff are under French control. You will see that the Philippines are under United States control by this time, as is Hawaii, if you didn't catch that, as is Puerto Rico, and for a little while after this, parts of Cuba will be as well. Then Australia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, all these places have come under the control of the British. And if you look at Japan, they have emerged as an imperial power. All right. And they have conquered Korea and Taiwan and are no longer under the rule of the Tokugawa family and have even taken little parts of Russia, if you can see up there. And again, real interesting story we'll look at there. So that is an example of the kinds of changes we're talking about during this age of imperialism. Okay, and we'll talk about the kind of conquests themselves in the next lecture. But for this one, another interesting map here that you can take the time to look at. This is made by Vox, that is pretty left or liberal, but there's not really anything with my knowledge of history that I could disagree with too much on this map as far as countries that have been invaded or colonized or controlled in some way by Europe or America. Um, it's pretty accurate that we've had military interventions or outright conquest and control of all of these areas at some time or another. All right, and we'll be looking at that throughout this. But what we're looking at in this lecture to focus in here is just the rationales for imperialism, the kinds of excuses that are given to justify that conquest, why people go out and do it in the first place. And towards the end, I've included a bunch of other cartoons like the one you see here, where you see this woman clad in white with this helmet. If you can see on the little plume on the helmet, it says Britannia. So she's this kind of female personification of Britain, waving this white banner of civilization, right? And she's got these red coat British soldiers and settlers and workers and stuff behind her, walking over these corpses, facing down these hordes of dark-skinned people that are waving the banner of barbarism. All right, this is a great example of how a lot of this conquest kind of gets framed, right? Civilization versus barbarism, right? We're bringing these people up out of the darkness. We're trying to help them. Is the excuse often given at this time? All right, so let's get into it. What are the excuses that help us name this here? All right, or why take over the world? Well, I've got a quote there from an old Greek war and a story about that war known as the Melian Dialogue. But a famous line from that uh, story or essay is, "The strong do as they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Well, at this period of time, Europe and America were the strong, and the rest of the world were the weak. And with the newly kind of gained power of industrial production and the military power that came along with that, the rapid growth in transportation speed and technology that comes along with that, um, the imperial nations that we're going to be talking about wanted to continue doing what they had been doing since Unit 4, growing in wealth and power and influence. And if you remember, we had talked about in Unit 4 ideas like God, gold, and glory as reasons for imperial expansion. Glory is still at kind of not the top of the list, but it's still on the list, right? Military conquest was still considered at that time a really legitimate path to growing the power of the state, and controlling colonies continued to be seen as this symbol that your country was a great power, right? That had this special status among countries in the 19th and 20th centuries. Maybe that's true today, but maybe we're a little less vocal about it. So that's one thing. Just like always, countries felt that through conquest and expansion they could make themselves more powerful, right? So that's still going on. The other changes that we'll start off with here have a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution leads to kind of, I think, two big causes for this imperial expansion. One has to do with resources, particularly the access to resources like rubber or tin or iron or copper or some other mineral. The fossil fuels that were being used, like coal and then eventually petroleum or oil. And then old commodities, things like cotton or wool or silk or whatever. All those things were needed, we'll say, by Europeans or Americans to continue their ever increasing manufacturing demands, right? They needed these resources to keep production at the levels they'd become accustomed to, right? What was making those countries so rich was their productive power. And without the resources, they could not continue that. So that's on the one hand, resources. The other big cause for imperial expansion that comes out of the revolution are markets. And that's something we've brought up a little bit before, that markets for the products that were manufactured with those resources are also needed, right? I told you, I've kind of joked with you guys. It's cool if your country's able to make 1 million t-shirts in a day. But kind of useless if you can't sell those t-shirts to anybody, right? It might actually be kind of a stupid thing to do. You're wasting money and resources. So to explain the issue of markets, let's kind of backtrack a little bit and remember that industrial manufacturing, and by that I mean sort of the manufacturing or the production of goods with the assistance of machinery, really efficient factories that had very specialized workers, national transportation networks of trains and steamships and stuff, international supply chains, all that stuff kind of goes together for industrial manufacturing. That kind of manufacturing was sometimes or often able to produce more consumer goods than citizens in those countries could buy themselves. All right, for a bunch of reasons that you could learn about in an economics class, things like market saturation, which is kind of the idea that for products with a decent lifespan, something that lasts, you know, 5 or 10 years or something, demand is going to naturally sort of decrease over time once everyone has a refrigerator or landline telephone or something like that, right? Or that the size of your middle class, the size of the people in your country that could afford those goods is only so big. And once you've sort of kind of tap that market out, like the demand is going to really slow down, and you're not going to be able to keep those factories and all those workers and all that profit growing at the speed that it was when everybody was buying that stuff. All right. And guys like Karl Marx at this time would be pointing out the general state of poverty of a lot of industrial workers, right? That a lot of the people working in those factories, they also couldn't afford to buy the products they were making. But that's going to change. Um, so either through conquest or colonization, or by using their superior industrial era military forces to kind of force bad trade deals on other countries, Europeans and America would pursue imperial expansion in part as a way to open up parts of the world where their trade had been limited, like China or Japan or India. And so to talk about those places to kind of give us a bigger understanding of this rationale, remember that China and Japan had confined Europeans and Americans as well to a single port of entry since the 16th or 17th centuries, right? To Nagasaki in Japan, where only the Dutch could go and trade, and to Canton or Guangzhou in China, where anybody can go and trade, but only at that one port. Modern economists, we call that protectionism. And our president's trade war with China, right, using tariffs to protect, you know, local industries. That's a form of protectionism. So something that still goes on. Europeans would use, and your Americans, all right, anytime I'm saying Europeans, we got to kind of include America in there, but they would use their newly widened technological gap of machine guns and all these kind of tools we'll look at in the next lecture here to force these countries to open up their borders to a flood of European products, right? Things like t-shirts, but all the way up to industrial machinery, like we read about in other articles when we were in class together. That's going to have big effects on those countries, some of them positive, but in the short term, a lot of them negative, right? Putting a lot of local producers out of business or in stiff competition with goods that could be produced cheaper and usually of better quality by these industrial countries, right? So another reason, I guess, so that's the markets idea, right? Is that part of it is countries wanted to open up those places to international competition, I guess, for these goods and be able to sell your stuff in somebody else's country in a way that would be really advantageous to you and not so good for the businesses in that other country. All right. The other thing that maybe kind of fits better with the resources idea is cheap labor. And this is something that really develops kind of towards the end of the age of imperialism and has more to do with what people call neo-colonialism, maybe stuff that's going on in the world today that looks a lot like imperialism that we're talking about in this unit. But basically, the idea that cheap labor becomes a kind of valued resources, that as industrial workers begin to form unions and go on strike and petition for better wages, in Western countries, they get those things, right? Their unions work and they get regulations on child labor and the safety of factories and better hourly wages and are, you only have to work 40 hours a week or things like that. Pollution controls, all those things are great for those workers and countries, but they make it increasingly expensive to do business there. And so something we see in the modern world and even during the early 1900s and so is industrial countries looking at other countries not just as sources of resources, but as a source of cheap labor where manufacturing jobs could be offshored or outsourced to increase your profit margin. All right. So I included a couple charts of modern day wages, right? This one's from 2010, so 10 years old, but I mean, it hasn't changed too much, right? A lot of these countries are still some of the cheapest places to produce things. Um, and if you look, this is in annual salary. So this is, according to the International Monetary Fund, a pretty legit group as far as this information goes. And these are, very low prices. You should check some of your clothes to see how many of them are made in some of these places. Probably a lot of them. But that's because those places have cheap labor, right? It's what lets you buy a, pair of cool jeans or something from H&M for $5 or something, right? The cost of production. And that is something that's a part of this as well. All right. Hourly compensation for manufacturing, so factory workers, hourly wages in US dollars for around 2010 and 2013. You can see the price of doing business in Europe or America versus the price of doing business in more developing parts of the world, where it's much, much cheaper. Okay, for these last bits of the lecture, we're going to shift from looking at economic motivations like resources, markets, cheap labor, to looking at ideologies and ideas that justified or rationalized imperial expansion as well. So we're going to talk about the white man's burden, sort of civilizing mission reason, and social Darwinism. All right. Social Darwinism is what we'll start with here. Um, and that one requires a little bit more explanation. So I'm going to try and break it down to you in 3 chunks here and be as quick as I can, but I've tried to shorten this up a couple times now, and man, I think it just requires a little bit of explanation. Okay, so let's get into it. The first part is what are Darwin's ideas, right? If we're going to talk about social Darwinism, what is the Darwin part of that? And Charles Darwin as a scientist, we want to talk about as a figure coming out of the end of the Enlightenment, all right, at the same time as guys like Sigmund Freud or things like that, if you remember from your textbook. But a 19th century scientist, he writes one of many books and articles on the origin of species in 1859, where he continues to lay out this theory of natural selection. Okay, and natural selection is closely related to evolution. It's kind of one of the pillars of explaining the theory of evolution. So a really important development for the modern world and modern science and our explanation of the world around us. And the core, I think, of natural selection is kind of explaining a scientific explanation for the differences between species and the ongoing differentiation between species, right? So Darwin's theory goes like this, that the natural world or the environment, I think that's a real easy way to think about it. Darwin says nature, but I think it's easier just to think the natural world has conditions. Those conditions are all kinds of things. You think about it: a climate, elevation, temperature, rainfall, the terrain you could be in, right? Like, are you on an island? Are you in a jungle or a forest or a desert or whatever? What are the what are what are the bushes around you look like? All those things are different kinds of conditions, right? That you find in natural environments, different biomes around the world, right? Um, And that within those environmental conditions, there's going to be all kinds of animals that live all over the world, these organisms. And those organisms have to live within those environments and respond and deal with the conditions they find themselves in there, right? They have to survive the challenges of life in those conditions. And Darwin's idea of natural selection said that some species would have traits that were favored in certain environmental conditions, right? I'm going to talk about the examples he gives of maybe having a beak, as a bird that was shaped a certain way that gave you an advantage in a certain environment, or maybe having wings as a bug that were a certain color that gave you a kind of natural camouflage that lets you sort of survive the hazards of the world a little bit better, right? And by survive, what Darwin's really talking about is not just sort of you staying alive, but you staying alive long enough to reproduce and pass on that trait, right? Pass on that cool shaped beak you had, or that like nicely colored wing that gave you camouflage. All right. So let's look at some examples. Darwin is most famous for, or maybe not most famous, but he's famous for visiting the Galapagos Islands on a couple voyages. The Galapagos Islands are a series of, I think there's over a dozen of these islands. And one of the animals that he paid attention to a lot of them, but one of the animals he looked at there were finches, a kind of finch on the Galapagos Islands. And natural selection comes in like this, okay? For Darwin, he saw that each island had, let's imagine, a different one of these birds that hopefully you see on the diagram here. And if you notice, all their, they look mostly the same, except their beaks are all a little bit different shapes and sizes. Darwin explained this by pointing out that each of the different Galapagos Islands had slightly different environments, right? Maybe one of these islands had more insects, let's say, on it, right? Lots of worms that hid in the ground or like burrowed into trees. And in that case, the finches, the kind of tree finches, if you see on the diagram there, that had long pointy beaks, let's say, like a woodpecker could kind of like poke into those holes and eat those worms, right? And if you had a short, stubby beak like those ground finches, you would not be as well suited to that, right? You would not be able to get all the food that the woodpecker one would, and you would, in competition with those birds, you would starve on those islands in general, and the other ones would have an advantage, right? Over a long period of time, a big advantage, and there would be more of that kind of bird with the long pointy beak eating insects, and fewer or maybe none of the stubby beaked seed eating birds on those islands, right? But the opposite would be true on those islands in the Galapagos where there were more seeds, right? You would see the birds with the thick, strong beaks that could crush seeds more frequently on the islands with those conditions, right? And the birds with the fragile, long, pointy beaks that were good for digging insects out of the ground, they weren't be as well suited to cracking open seeds. So in this example, nature, Darwin would say, has selected for a certain trait, the beak shape, that was most well adapted to an certain environment, a particular island, okay, and the kinds of food that was available on that island. So that bird with that beak shape kind of fit into that little environmental or ecological niche, right? Better than other animals, was more competitive and survivable in that environment. The other animal that gets used as an explanation for kind of supporting natural selection is the peppered moth, okay, which I guess is a moth that's very common in parts of England and normally looks like the ones that have the white and brown speckles on it, if you see those. And people noticed that around the time that industrialization begins in England and the environment began to be polluted, let's say by soot and smog and dust and, literally coating everything. Like the soot would be so thick from these coal powered factories that the, you know, houses, the trees, the, pavement and steps and stuff like that would be kind of coated in this brown, smoggy dust, right? Or sometimes the trees coated in black soot was a reality of these industrial cities. Well, in those conditions, this naturally occurring variation in those moths, where normally they're the white and brown speckled looking wings, every now and then, very rarely, the ones that were totally brown would be born, right? Just as kind of like a natural variation. Um, when the cities became sort of soot covered and polluted, that natural variation was selected for by that environment, let's say. Okay. And the birds and predators of these moths had an easier time picking out those white speckled moths than they did the brown ones. All right. And so the brown moth became more common in that area throughout the industrial era. And the, you know, white and black or white and brown one or whatever it is, that one became less common. It was hunted and killed easier. Okay. So again, that's another example of a separate environment. This one, more interestingly, kind of rapidly created by human interference, but created the conditions where one trait was kind of, unintentionally, let's say, selected for by nature. The brown wings, right, gave this moth a natural camouflage to the birds and predators around it. So that's my not biology teacher explanation of natural selection. Okay, well, how does that kind of Darwinian idea? Well, how does that connect to social Darwinism? All right. So Herbert Spencer is this guy, and I got a little quote from him there. Herbert Spencer is uh, the guy that actually comes up with the phrase "survival of the fittest" that we often associate with Darwin. But Herbert Spencer actually uses that phrase to describe Darwin's ideas after he reads On the Origin of Species, and Darwin gets it from him. Actually, he's like, "Oh yeah, it's kind of a good way to describe my ideas." Um, but Herbert Spencer can be considered like the first social Darwinist, except Herbert Spencer was like an economist. He's not a biologist, or wasn't a biologist. Um, so his application of these ideas was to society, was to economies, where he said he thought the whole idea kind of worked just the same. Um, that instead of the natural world of the wilderness, society and conditions within societies were changing, that were selecting for certain traits. Okay, and because he's an economist, he gives the example of hard economic times like a depression or a recession, which was becoming more common in the industrial age, right? Um, and is kind of really relevant to us with the sort of economic struggles due to coronavirus right now. Okay, Herbert Spencer argued against, for example, like an economic stimulus. All right, he believed that governments should not do anything to help their citizens make it through periods of unemployment or financial uncertainty. For Herbert Spencer, for social Darwinists, those economic conditions of a depression or a recession were the same as those conditions found in nature for Darwin, right? Like islands that had more seeds or more insects or things like that, right? Or cities that had more, brown colored leaves or more, lighter colored leaves or whatever, gave advantages to moths. He said people had certain traits, whatever those traits might be, maybe a propensity for taking risk, or a kind of hardworking attitude, being more likely to save money or plan for the future. But he said people had traits that were going to help them, sort of survive or prosper in society and in the different conditions that society produced, like a depression or a recession. And for social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer to continue with his idea, he said those hard times would sort of kill people off. Kind of, it's pretty grim, right? Like, but that's the most extreme version of the scenario. Basically, that those people would starve. They would not reproduce as much, right? Their kids would get sick or something. They wouldn't be able to afford the help. They would not do well in those hard times. And the people that had traits that would do well, they would do well, and they would go on and they would have more kids and pass on those traits. And so government involvement was just sort of getting in the way of that. And you should just kind of let people sink or swim, right? So in a real capitalist kind of sense, it sort of said, hey, you don't have to look out for the little guy. This is social Darwinism. Let him sink or swim. This is finding who's weak and who's strong in our society, right? But it's kind of a ruthless point of view, all right, which is why it's probably not as popular nowadays anymore. Okay, um, that's social Darwinism. And so the final part of this is to talk about how was this idea of social Darwinism, this ideology, a rationale for imperialism. Um, and so it goes something like this, basically, that perspective of social Darwinism as an ideology begins to be applied globally to justify, to rationalize the conquest that was taking place. All right. That some Europeans began to argue that their cultures, their civilizations must be more inherently suited or better adapted to the competition of the modern industrial interconnected world, that European or American cultures, civilizations, societies had favorable traits, whatever those might be. And for these guys, often they're talking about nation states, right? So there's a racial component to this for early social Darwinists too, and modern ones. That there were racial traits or societal traits selected sort of by world events and history and all that that put those countries in a position of dominance economically, politically, culturally, etc. And that they kind of deserved to be there, right? That there had been a sorting process in life and that they had risen to the top because they had the natural qualities that were advantageous in that situation, right? And that is kind of the application to imperialism, that the idea that the fittest civilizations would be the ones that rose to the top, and that those cultures should replace the inferior cultures of the world with Western civilization, Western religions, Western economic and government systems, and all that. And so, to kind of wrap that up, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate there and explaining it from the social Darwinist point of view, but that's to help kind of point out the danger in that line of thinking, that you can see it really easily leads to kind of racial supremacist kind of thinking, like the Nazis, who you could describe as social Darwinists, that say some groups should be sterilized or removed from the population or the gene pool altogether, right? So a real risky line of thinking that gets you to some very dangerous places and ignores a lot of the other explanations we gave for these same topics. Like if you remember watching Guns, Germs, and Steel and talking about how technological progress, disease immunity, things like that, these adaptations might have more to do with your geographic location, the amount of interaction or isolation you've had with other cultures and civilizations, than they do with one group of people being smarter or better than another. The last idea here is the idea of kind of the civilizing mission as one of the things that's sort of fueling or justifying imperialism. Rudyard Kipling, who I've got in the picture there, the poet that we read, his poem "The White Man's Burden," is kind of the phrase that really sort of takes the spot of that of civilizing mission, right? The white man's burden is what's kind of used to describe that idea a lot. And it's this idea that growing out of some kind of enlightenment mentality or Christian charity, that Europe and America sort of owed it to the world, to the less developed parts of the world, to build railroads for them to um, build running water systems, to spread Western education or Christianity and Western fashions and morality to these less developed parts of the world, sort of like as a kind of charity out of the goodness of their heart or something, right? And on top of that was the idea that this was a kind of burden, was that it was this difficult thing for those countries like Britain or America to do, and that it was thankless, right? That the imperialist country would be hated by the people they were allegedly just trying to help. All right. Um, but I commented on a lot of your poems, those of you that responded to it in the discussion board, um, that I think Kipling is being very sincere. That a lot of the stuff he says in the poem, and I'd like to make another video maybe where I break down the poem for you, um, but that he's being really sincere. That conquering other parts of the world, the conquerors sort of owe it to have this obligation to these people to better them, right? And his poem, White Man's Burden, is sort of a letter to America after their recent conquest of the Philippines from the Spanish Empire, sort of telling them like, all right, you've conquered this place. That's the easy part. Now you've got to take on sort of the white man's burden, right? Now you've got to help these people, and they're going to fight you kicking and screaming the whole way, right? It's an interesting poem. I'd like to break it down for you. But a couple things I'll leave you with here are a couple cartoons that are all titled The White Man's Burden, okay? And these are all 18th century cartoons, or excuse me, 19th and 20th century cartoons. This one's great in sort of showing the mentality that people had, right? As an historical document, this is fantastic. Where you've got these two figures. The guy in the front is John Bull. He's sort of England's Uncle Sam. And then you've got Uncle Sam. And both of these two guys, they've got these baskets strapped to their back with all these people in them. And the people are their colonial subjects. So Britain has people from China and the Ottoman Empire and India and Arabs. And this guy has a Zulu banner on him. He's a South African. And then America, Uncle Sam is carrying Hawaiians and Cubans and Puerto Ricans. On his back here, right? And a handful of other people as well, Filipinos and so on. And if you look at the kind of rocky path, this sort of rocky path they are climbing, all the rocks are labeled things, barbarism, oppression, superstition, brutality, slavery, cruelty, cannibalism, ignorance, right? And they are carrying them up towards this shining, glowing lady of civilization. All right. So sort of shows, hey, we're not doing this for us, right? We're doing this for you people. And you see they're pouring sweat, and it's this hard thing for them. And it's like, oh, it's to better these kind of savage looking people on their back. Right? This is also called The White Man's Burden. And this is a cartoon from the Filipino-American War, which is a really ruthless and bloody war, where Filipinos, after America defeats Spain in the Spanish-American War, thought that they were going to receive their independence. Instead, they became a colony of America after recently being a colony of Spain. And we engage in a ruthless struggle against Filipinos and kill hundreds of thousands of people there. And a couple thousand American soldiers die, I think 4,000, mostly from disease and stuff like that. But not a high point in American history. And you see the kind of racist depiction of Filipinos, this kind of blackface looking caricature of a person here. It looks all covered in feathers and grass and stuff like that, being sort of carried forcibly by this tough American soldier, to the schoolhouse. This one's also called White Man's Burden, and it shows, in this case, representations of, again, England or America or Germany being carried on the backs of their colonies, right? And so you see the white man's burden is no burden at all. In fact, they're a burden to these people that are having to carry them around, is sort of the joke. And then this last one is an advertisement for Pear's soap. It says the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. All right, and you've got a little image of like a missionary handing out soap to a native person on some island. But the idea there is, you've got examples of people kind of happily using that phrase, right, without feeling racist or anything like that, that they feel like they are improving the world. And from their point of view, they very likely are. Like, if I didn't say it before, I think we use these same justifications today when we get involved in foreign countries, that we are trying to spread democracy, right? Or we're trying to elevate the status of women, or we want to, bring the freedom of speech to these places, or it's wrong for Hong Kong to have to belong to China because they're going to lose all these kind of democratic rights and things that they had, and so that justifies whatever involvement we want to give to certain regions of the world or assistance we want to give to people, right? And that might be a big part of it. I think we do believe that's why we're doing those things. Just like I think Kipling believed in the white man's burden, and that they did have this obligation to help these places out. Doesn't mean that there aren't sort of ulterior motives lurking beneath the surface. Okay, and we'll see some of those as we finish up the unit here. All right. So thank you for that, and hope it wasn't too long and that it kind of helped your understanding for 6.1. I'll keep trying to do this and see if I can't make them a little bit better as we go along. So please comment if you're able to do that on the video, suggestions or tips or encouragement or whatever, and I would appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Have a good one, guys.